I wanted you to chime in on Mr. Jim Clark. Again, his birthday was last week, wasn't it? He would have been 89.
Would he?
Last week, yeah. Birthday March the 4th, I think. Talk to me about Jim. Why, as somebody who didn't see Jim Clark race, I've heard the stories that he was incredible behind the wheel of a car, that he had this otherworldly feel and could do things with a car that not too many men or women in F1 history have been able to. Try and articulate to people that didn't see Jim behind the wheel of a car at the time, that maybe have never seen a Jim Clark race. What was it that made Jim Clark so special, and that what is it about Jim that makes F1 aficionados like yourself, Peter, declare him probably, beyond all reasonable doubt, the best F1 driver to have ever done
it? It's a very, very long conversation, Cameron. I think, in a nutshell, in the era in which he drove, the softness of his touch, his balance, his feel for the surface of the road, his coordination, his ability to feel a car on the edge, all those things were quite visible because of the cars of that time, the narrow tires, the way they moved. So you had a really, if Clark was in a Lotus Cortina, you could see that he was putting the car at the perfect angle, mid-corner. The front wheel would be off the ground. He'd be just a little bit over the curb, just to shorten the corner a little bit in the middle. And then everything would be perfectly straight on exit. If he was in a Lotus 30 with a terrible flexing chassis, very heavy, overpowered engine at the back, you'd see his inputs minimizing the effect of the chassis flex and still making the car look pretty good, but you'd see a car with a lot of opposite lock at any given moment. But when the opposite lock was applied, it was never that. It was always in a perfect harmony with the car. So it always looked like it was on a piece of string, and yet often the wheels a bit at a different angle to the rear. And that manifested itself in perfectly even tire wear on all four tires in a way that Dunlop, who were his main tire supplier for most of his career, had never seen on another driver and never would. And he was intelligent. You know, we were talking about Charles and Lewis working off one another and benefiting from one another. Think about when Graham Hill rejoined Lotus in 67 with the new Lotus 49 with the Cosworth engine. Jim won first time out at Zandvoort. And I think Jim learnt from Graham Hill that year how not to break the Lotus 49. And Jim's reliability in that car was better than Graham's. And you could say a lot of it was just circumstance. Often in the case of Graham, it was a rotor button or a spark plug or something stupid. But then it was also drive shafts, and it was also suspension arms and pickup points and things like that. And Jimmy found in 67, if you look at the stats, he doesn't look to be as quick as Graham Hill, but he found, even within that very fragile car, he found a sweet spot of just keeping the thing on the road, to the point where he'd win the 67 US Grand Prix with the rear suspension half collapse, the inside right rear wheel canted to the left, but still won the race. Same with the 66 US Grand Prix. Nobody else won a race in that BRM H16 3-litre engine behind them, and yet Jimmy did. Very difficult engine, blowing out oil and rubbish the whole time, but he managed to keep the thing going for a Grand Prix distance. So he had this amazing mechanical sympathy, probably more than better than any other time at the 65 British Grand Prix, when he had the Coventry Climax fuel-injected V8 behind him and 1.5 litre, and leading Graham Hill by about 25 seconds with 20 laps to go. He started to lose oil pressure and knew that there was very little chance he was going to win that Grand Prix. So he started to think, no radio in those days, no way of communicating with Colin Chapman in the pit lane, or Dick Scammell, who was chief mechanic at the time, went on to run Cosworth. But he took it upon himself to think, right, through Stowe and Club, the corners with the highest G, which could do the most damage to the bearings if I'm losing oil, I'm just going to switch off the engine, which he did. And so he would coast through those two corners, and then he'd declutch and get the run up to Abbey again. So Chapman didn't know he was doing this, because when he came out of Woodcote down pit straight, it sounded pretty much as normal. All he could see was Graham Hill catching him. And Jimmy was making a few hand signals. And he won the race, just won the race. Under pressure, he was brilliant. 64 European Grand Prix, Graham Hill in his mirrors the whole way, in probably what was a BRM at least as quick as the Lotus 33. Jimmy, no mistakes, just perfect under pressure. And he was a bit shy, a bit embarrassed by all the ballyhoo, as he would call it, and the garland would be around his neck, and he'd put on a pullover maybe and wave to the crowd. But there wouldn't be a lot of self-congratulatory, I'm brilliant, I can win this, I can win the championship, I'm number one. None of that stuff. It was always very reserved, and I'm lucky to be a part of this sport. I love this sport from the point of view of driving interesting cars in interesting ways on interesting circuits. And it's a privilege for me to do it. 67 Eifelrennen on the South Circuit at the Nürburgring, a circuit that doesn't exist today. There was ice on the border of the track. There was probably black ice on the road. There were trees bounding the circuit all the way around. It's about an 8-mile lap, a bit like a mini Nürburgring. Ice, snow, trees. And there was talk before the race amongst the drivers that maybe they shouldn't do it because it was a bit dodgy. And Jimmy was one of the drivers. He said, no, we've got 120,000 spectators here. We need to put on a show. Let's start the race, get in the car. And so it went on. He was fit, he was polite, he was kind, he was humble, he loved driving racing cars. And I was lucky enough to sit down with him for 20 minutes or so and chat to him. And he knew me a little bit. I was a 13-year-old kid, but he spent 20 minutes with me, talking to me, allowing me to ask him questions and giving me support in a way that meant a lot to me. And don't forget, this year, and what was it, 60 years ago, 1965, he not only won the Formula One World Championship, securing it by the German Grand Prix in August, but he also won the Indianapolis 500 in that year and didn't do the Monaco Grand Prix in order to do that. Now, that is an achievement that will never, ever be matched, I don't think. It's never been done, of course, before. World Championship, F1 and Indy in the same year. And it probably never will be again. And that just shows how good Jim Clark was. And that wasn't the only thing he won in 65. He also won the Tasman Series, which I was lucky enough to see a part of. And he won numerous Formula 2 races, numerous touring car races, sports car races, and just never stopped. In fact, 65 for me, 1965, was one of the best years ever in the history of humanity because Formula One was safe. The cars were perfectly suited to the circuits. If you look at a Lotus 33 at Clermont-Ferrand, quite a narrow track, undulating, mountainous, quite dangerous, obviously, in terms of no runoff area. But a Lotus 33 there just looks superb. And it was just before the cars started changing to sponsorship colours. So it's a green and yellow Lotus. It's Jimmy in the light blue Dunlop overalls. It's Jackie Stewart in the dark green BRM with the orange nose. Everything's quite small, but it fits and everything looks balanced and perfect. And Formula One was very safe that year. There were very few big accidents. There were no fatalities that I'm aware of in 65. And Indianapolis was a safe race as well in 65. Yep, some nasty things were going on in the world. There was the Vietnam War, and obviously there was all the racial unrest in the United States. But overall, 65 wasn't a bad year. I mean, the Beatles, it was before they went crazy and Flower Power, which was still a great time, but it was just before that. And it was quite small lapels on their suits and the Ray-Bans. And Jimmy wore Island cotton polo shirts and flannels and sort of brogue shoes. And always carried a briefcase when he was out of, traveling, and quite often was in a Lotus Elan as his road car. Even in America, even at Indy, every day he had a Lotus Elan car was provided for him, which he drove around in. It was just a great era. What a great time. And that was Jim Clark. Great name too for a racing driver, isn't it? Jim Clark. Sounds quick, I think.